started. So welcome to the 40th annual Bernice Fox Classics Lecture. And we are thrilled and honored that Kirsten Day, Dr. Kirsten Day, is delivering this year's lecture. And Jamie Wolchey will be introducing her shortly. But I would like first to explain the lecture, introduce its honorand, note the inception of the lecture, and then introduce Jimmy. First, for those who don't know me, I am Bob Polsher-Simmons, Professor and Chair of Classics at Monmouth. This long-standing lecture honors Bernice Fox, whom Tom Sinkowitz succeeded as Chair of Classics at Monmouth with the gap of 2 years, and I succeeded Tom in 2016. I would like to pass on some comments on Professor Fox, who died before I could meet her, that Tom shared with me. Bernice Fox was hired at Monmouth in 1947 to teach English, but gradually moved over to teach Latin. If she had not done so, classics would probably have died out at Monmouth. Although Bernice offered a traditional language-based classics curriculum, she also taught classical mythology and word elements. Frequently she taught Greek, but only as an overload. She retired from the classroom in 1981. This lecture series was established in her name in 1985. She was the first Fox lecturer. Her topic was Living Latin, 20th Century Literature in Latin. For many years, the Fox lecturer was either one of her students, or a colleague, or a good friend. She spent her retirement translating some of her favorite authors into Latin. Tila Carlotti, last second. In advance? Hey, good. Tila Carlotti, her translation of E.B. White's Charlotte's Web was published in 1991 by HarperCollins. She was a Titan here, and Monmouth College honored her with an honorary degree of Doctor of Humane Letters in 1991, the same year as the publication of Tila Carlotti. When she died in 2003, at the age of 92, she left the bulk of her estate to the classics department. That bequest funded much of the endowed professorship that I now hold, succeeding Tom Sinkowitz. He too has done much to preserve Professor Fox's memory, not only arranging the Fox Lecture for decades, but also arranging for some of the funds for the bequest to be used for an elegant classical meal that precedes the lecture, for an international classics-based writing contest for high school students, and for teacher training grants for aspiring teachers, facilitated by Eta Sigma Phi, the National Undergrad Classics Honor Society. Bernice Fox was a remarkable woman. The Classics Department and Monmouth College owe her an eternal debt of gratitude for her dedication, tenacity, and generosity. None of us would be in this room right now if it were not for Bernice. I would now like to say a few words of introduction of Jimmy Wolchey, who will in turn be introducing Dr. Day. Jimmy Wolchey is a senior, double majoring in classics and art. They are a Dean's List honoree every semester of the time at Monmouth. An initiate into the Eta Sigma Phi Honor Society for Excellence in Classics, the Classics Tutor and Student Worker, winner of the Monmouth Vicky Wine Award for Excellence in Greek in spring 2024, winner of the Best in Painting Award at the Monmouth Jury Certain Art Show in fall 2024, and has been part of the Classics Student Research Team working on migration, transplantation, and refugeeism in the ancient world that has been funded by a $150,000 grant shared with English, History, and Philosophy and Religious Studies from the National Endowment for the Humanities. From that research, they have been a part of presentations on those topics to audiences at the meetings of the Illinois Classical Conference and the Illinois Junior Classical League this year. To introduce our speaker, Jimmy Wolchey.
Dr. Kirsten Day is Professor and Chair of Classics at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois, where she also contributes to the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Augustana Prison Education programs. She received bachelor's degrees in Ancient Mediterranean Civilizations and Art History from Rice University and a PhD in Comparative Literature from the University of Arkansas. The courses she teaches are all over the classics curriculum, including all levels of Latin and Greek, though often touching on contemporary themes such as women in classical antiquity, race and ethnicity in antiquity, Troy from Homer to Hollywood, and Greek warrior and combat trauma. As testament to the quality of teacher that she was notified just last week that she is the 2025 recipient of the Award for Teaching Excellence at the post-secondary level from the Classical Association of the Middle West and South. Her research interests focus primarily on ways in which the classical world is depicted in the contemporary one. In addition to her 2016 book, Cowboy Classics, The Roots of the American Western in the Epic Tradition, published by Edinburgh University Press, she has published a host of articles on classics and popular culture, including Oedipal Anxieties in HBO's Westworld, and Looking a Gift Horse in the Mouth, Helen of Troy and the Trojan Horse. Her work with inmates at the East Moline Correctional Center has also led to her most recent article, Classics and the Incarcerated, published in January in Classical Outlook. In addition, Dr. Day has not been a stranger to Monmouth. She has brought students and/or her own kids to 4 of Monmouth's Classics Days, and she has brought contingents from Augustana to take part in the 2023 Eta Sigma Phi National Meeting and the 2024 Illinois Classical Conference Meeting, both of which Monmouth hosted. We are delighted and honored to have her back again for this talk. To deliver Fallout Age of Heroes, the Trojan War and its aftermath, please welcome Dr. Kirsten Day.
Sorry, I knew that was gonna happen. Let's see. Okay. Can y'all hear me? Yeah? Okay. Can y'all hear me? Okay, we'll see if that holds. Thank you, Jimmy, for that lovely introduction. Hopefully I can live up to it. That's very nice. Okay. Are we good now?
Can you, are you able to close the,
Let's see.
here we go, your business.
I got a mess. I like seeing the thing. It's not very starry. It's moving.
So, we can see up here.
Oh. It takes a village. Yes.
Did you want this like this, like two?
Slide one. So you don't, you know, it's off track. All right, thank you. Sorry for leaving us to the start. All right. So, war, as they say, is done. But in antiquity, to die in war was seen as the best and most heroic death, a death even to be wished for, as we hear from Odysseus, the hero of Homer's Odyssey, and as was expressed explicitly my poets, both Greek and Roman. To die fighting in the front ranks was honorable and heroic. Today, too, we valorize and honor the men and women who died fighting in battle, even drawing directly on these ancient sentiments in our nation's memorials. So I don't know if you can see it on here, but at the top it says, Dolce et Decorum est, purple for your dying, which is, of course, is line from the previous slide. Both then and now, fallen soldiers are regularly honored in public forums. So while the violence and brutality of war is horrific, there is honor and glory to be won. War may be hell, but in some ways it's straightforward. The fallout, however, is not so simple. And for what happens after the war is over, there is no pithy expression. It is messy and complicated, and there is no clear template for how to move on. In ancient narratives about the Trojan War, the difficulties with rebuilding after defeat are suggested by Aeneas's arduous journey followed by another war in Virgil's Roman epic, the Aeneid. While the difficulty with reintegration even for the victors is symbolized by the returns of the Greek warriors after the fall of Troy, which are marked by infighting, delays, and for some, violent death. My cousin, Bo Gum, an Iraq war veteran, touched on the disorientation and lack of a clear path for returning veterans in his 2017 memoir, Immaterial Children, as we see here. An ancient parallel to this feeling of abandonment by the military is suggested by Brian Dory's acknowledgement that although he primarily examines this character through the lens of a chronically ill patient, Philoctetes is also, quote, a veteran who had been abandoned by the nation that sent him to war, end quote. Tonight, we will consider the aftermath of the Trojan War both in antiquity and through a modern lens, considering the post-war experiences of mythological combat veterans as reflections of real-world responses to trauma similar to those seen in their soldiers today. And although war in the ancient world was almost always exclusively a male activity, with women either on the margins of the action or at a great remove, this did not shield them from the consequences of the violence. Tonight we will also consider the direct and indirect effects of war on the wives and mothers, sisters and daughters, who are subject to the repercussions of the martial male agenda. So first, a quick content advisory. This discussion will not shy away from some of the horrors of war. Please be advised that in addition to references to violence and death, there will also be discussion of suicide and wartime atrocities, including rape, mutilation, enslavement, and the death of children, as well as some profane language. If you need to step out, you're welcome to do so. And also a quick disclaimer, I'm not a veteran. And my interactions with veterans regarding their experiences in war, even the ones in my family, have been limited. There may be some combat veterans in the audience, or close family members of combat veterans, and my aim is not to speak for you or to tell you the meaning of your own experience, but to explore important meanings and promote a deeper understanding of the literature of antiquity, encouraging empathy in those, like me, who have been insulated from the hardships of war. After my presentation, we'll open up the floor to discussion, and I welcome perspectives from anyone who would like to speak, particularly veterans or members of their family. Next, I am not a psychiatrist, a counselor, or a therapist, so these discussions about war and its aftermath are hard, and the tentacles may reach well beyond combat zones, touching on traumas that many of us have lived. For some people, navigating the difficulty with the help of a professional expert is necessary, and I'm not that person. And for me to try to be would be a disservice to you and to me. So after at the end of the slideshow, I have some resources available, and I also have some handouts on resources if anybody needs them. At Augustana, I do teach with a prison education program called APEP, which you heard earlier, where many of my students in the East Bowling Correctional Center find useful analogies between their own experiences and those of combat veterans. I've also taught a course on Greek warrior myths and combat trauma, both inside the prison and on our Rock Island campus, where I'm currently teaching it for the third time. So I do hope I have something relevant and useful to say that is not outside of my scope of practice. So what is my scope of practice? Well, I think it's my responsibility as a teacher to develop an understanding about different meanings for different audiences. To recognize that some in my classroom will have experienced trauma, which may make the subject matter more difficult. To to promote awareness of the different readings and to encourage empathy in a more general population. And when difficulties arise, to help my students find the resources that they need. All right, so I'm going to start with a little overview of some of the scholarship. So first, when I started getting interested in classics was in high school, and it was the Iliad that really grabbed me. At the time, the epics was just really super interesting to me. While I soon developed a more mature connection to the story where I recognized profound emotional truths in Achilles' experience, I still read it largely as an analogy. Thinking of the horrors of war that are recounted in the epic, like Achilles dragging Hector's body behind his chariot, thinking of those as literary pretenses is a lot easier than thinking of them as things that can and do happen. I did not recognize the more literal truth in Achilles' experience as a warrior until I encountered Jonathan Shea's Achilles in Vietnam. In this important work, Shea demonstrates that Achilles' story says something profoundly real about actual combat situations and the trauma that often follows warriors home. In his follow-up work, Odysseus in America, Shea traces the aftermath of war, looking at Achilles' experiences in Homer's Odyssey as representing truths about the experience of warriors returning home. Shea's work is not just an academic exercise, however. In writing these books, he was inspired by his work with Vietnam veterans, in which he found these ancient works therapeutically useful. When I read Achilles in Vietnam, alongside the Iliad with my incarcerated students in the fall of 2022, it resonated very deeply with many of them as well. For example, Jeremy, whose wife and sons had been violently assaulted in his home by rivals looking for drug money, identified very deeply with the berserk state that Shea discusses Achilles enters after the death of Patroclus, a state that led both men to take murderous vengeance. While Shea is a psychiatrist and not a classicist, his work has been very influential, both in the military and on our discipline. Most of the scholarly works that I will mention in this talk acknowledge a debt to Shea, and in the years following the publication of Achilles in Vietnam, as these book covers suggest, classical scholars have increasingly made connections between the myths of antiquity and historical characters, events, and realities in our own world, recognizing that ancient works not only contain truths that speak to us today, but they can also help shed light on our world as we view it through an ancient lens. In discussing the aftermath of war in particular, I want to acknowledge two others who, following Shea's lead, have done important work outside the classroom with real-world applications. Peter Meineck, Associate Professor of Classics in the Modern World at New York University, is the director of Aquila Theater, which since 2008 has been a leader in applied theater and humanities programming, including a project called Ancient Greeks of Modern Lives, which stages readings from current translations of Greek epic and 5th century drama centered on war, followed by workshops, town hall style meetings, and open discussions between veterans and their neighbors. He has also been active in producing scholarships in this area as well. Brian Dories co-founded the Theater of War Productions in 2009 and currently serves as its artistic director. Theater of War has partnered with numerous organizations and government agencies to present dramatic readings from important works, including ancient Greek tragedies, in order to communalize grief and promote empathy. Theater of War has served over 500,000 people in over 100 countries since its founding, addressing issues such as climate crisis, police violence, caretaking, incarceration, immigration, homelessness, racism, sexual assault, and more. And like Meineck, Dories has produced books on this topic as well. As with Achilles in Vietnam, I have seen Dories' work resonate profoundly with my students in the East Bowling Correctional Center. In response to Dories' account of a corrections officer asserting identification with Prometheus in Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, my APEP student CJ drew a line, staking a passionate claim on behalf of himself and other incarcerated individuals for primary identification with this mythological titan. So, now that we've introduced some of the players, we're going to start with Odysseus in America, which Shea opens with a discussion of the Phaeacians. In the Odyssey, after 10 years of war, Odysseus encounters many obstacles and delays on his way home, finally landing on the island of Scheria, a utopian place peopled by the Phaeacians, skilled sailors who will eventually take him home. Shea describes the Phaeacians as, quote, rich and secure, end quote, and says that Odysseus finds them self-indulgent. They insist on whining and dining him, and but when a bard sings stories of the Trojan War, the gulf between them is revealed. To the Phaeacians, it's sheer entertainment, but to Odysseus, it opens the gates of grief. Eventually, the Phaeacians ask him to tell them of the war. Although they are good hosts, as Shay notes, the Phaeacians are eager to hear a story purely for the entertainment value, and they seem fairly oblivious to the trauma that Odysseus has suffered. As I confessed earlier, when I first came to Homer's epics, I was like the Phaeacians, eager to hear the stories I found wildly entertaining, but like the Phaeacians, as Shay puts it, I was a, quote, tourist in the landscape of suffering, end quote. It was easy then to think of the atrocities recounted in the Iliad, such as Achilles dragging Hector's corpse behind his chariot, mutilating his body inside of his wife and his parents, as pure fictional pretense. I was content not to entertain the possibility that any real human would be capable of such a horror. But of course, they are. And even in modern times, American soldiers have done very similar things, as have other enemy defenders. In his book, Theater of War, Doris tells of a reading of an ancient Greek play, Ajax, which centers on the suicide of the titular Greek warrior after he has been disrespected and feels himself shamed by a mental breakdown. In the discussion afterwards, Doris asks the audience of veterans why Sophocles might have written this play, and one answers, he wrote it to boost morale. Doris asks, what is so morale boosting about watching a decorated warrior descend into madness and take his own life? And the veteran responds, it's the truth, and we are all here watching it together. While Ajax suicide does not occur in the context of the war's aftermath, Doris has used his story with audiences of combat veterans to help them process difficulties with post-war trauma, including delusions, erratic or violent behavior, and thoughts of suicide. He also utilizes his wife Tecmessa's story to help the partners of wounded warriors grapple with the difficulties of living with a veteran who exhibits symptoms of extreme psychological distress. On a related note, one of my incarcerated students, James Ben, used Ajax's death and Tecmessa's grief to process the pain he felt over his cousin's suicide. For him, he said, the play brought his pain to light and offered, quote, a window for viewers to recognize that they are not alone, end quote. Many veterans find comfort in acknowledgement of the truth, and sometimes seeing it through the lens of a piece of literature can offer an inroad. As the authors of Health Humanities put it, quote, it is through the arts and humanities that we have access to the meetings, narratives, adjudications, and interventions of a multitude of other people across the broad sweep of history and different cultures. The arts and humanities rescue us from the sometimes stultifying localism or myopia of a particular discipline or social situation, end quote. So with that, let us start with some warriors, particularly Odysseus, whose story is most fully told. His post-war adventures are narrated in great detail in Homer's Odyssey. Shay reads books 9 through 12, and this is the most famous part of the epic, where we get to hear all the adventures with Cyclops and other magical beings and goddesses and mythical creatures. So Shay reads this as an allegory of veteran struggles to get home. Although some of his analysis seems a bit forced in my opinion, his overall thesis is sound. He identifies in the narrative a number of coping mechanisms that veterans utilize to deal with trauma after their return to civilian life, including staying in combat mode, addiction, thrill-seeking, and workaholism. He points out that 3 of these, which are so prominent in Odysseus' story, represent the hated Vietnam veteran stereotype: violent crime, drug addiction, and irresponsible thrill-seeking. In the interest of time, we're just going to look at 2 of these, how they manifest in the Odyssey. So first, staying in combat mode. Odysseus' first stop is in Isthmus, where he makes a pure pirate raid. They go in, attack the town, and raid their supplies, and when they get them, they settle down to a feast and start drinking, and then the inhabitants come and attack and kill several of his men before they make their escape. Shay reads this as the first way that combat soldiers lose their way home after leaving the war zone. They simply remain in combat mode, although not necessarily against the original enemy. This is evident, too, in Odysseus' encounter with Scylla, where he insists on arming for battle despite Circe's warning that there's no point and it might even be counterproductive. relates the tendency for veterans to stay in combat mode to the fact that the skills and strengths that war prepares you for become problematic in peacetime. The only career that war prepares you for almost exactly is a criminal career, as these skill sets kind of suggest. Shea sees this as the path most destructive to the veteran and the civilian world around him, and Homer foregrounds it by putting this pirate raid first. The connection that Shea draws between military service and a life of crime may make some uncomfortable. One of my Rock Island campus students recently said in response to Shea's assertion that combat is a condition of captivity and enslavement, that was hard to digest, that those serving in something typically so respected like the military might have similar experiences to those who are imprisoned or enslaved. While we should acknowledge that there are important differences, Shea's point has some merit. The Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates that there are about 180,000 United States veterans in our prisons and jails. Indeed, my Iraqi war vet cousin Bo, along with an older cousin who served in Vietnam, both served time in jail or prison on multiple occasions. On a lighter note, the Coen brothers' 2000 comedy Oh Brother, Where Art Thou hangs on this analogy, showcasing Ulysses S. McGill's difficulties of reintegration, including estrangement from his wife and family, which we'll be talking about a bit later. While the aforementioned episodes show Odysseus staying in combat mode physically, the Sirens episode demonstrates veterans' tendency to stay in combat mode psychologically. The Song of the Sirens is alluring because they know everything that the Greeks and the Trojans suffered in wide Troy. Their song traps the sailors, just like many veterans get trapped in and obsessed with the past. The voice of the Sirens, as Shea puts it, is the voice of a wartime past experienced as more real and meaningful than the present. The Sirens thus represent the soldier's inability to escape the reality of war and fully return home. Roberto Pasolini's 2024 film, The Return, does an excellent job of tapping into post-war trauma of these sorts and suggests the truth that lies behind these narratives, and the trailer which proclaims some legends are more than myths. In several scenes, Rafe finds Odysseus applies this tendency to stay in combat mode. When the swineherd Eumaeus tells him, "The war, you should forget it, it was years ago," Odysseus replies, "It's everywhere, everything we see and touch, everything, waiting for me to make it happen again." And he later tells his wife, Penelope, "For some, war becomes home." Another way that Shea sees the tendency of some veterans to cope with post-combat stress in Odysseus' adventures is through substance abuse. This is most explicit in the adventure with the lotus eaters, where several of Odysseus' men eat the lotus and become forgetful of their duties, longing only to stay and eat the lotus forever. As Shea says, the message is clear enough. You get into lotus abuse, you lose your homecoming. Homer reinforces this later when Circe's drug wipes from their memories any thoughts of home, turning them into pigs, a clear metaphor for the dehumanizing effects of drugs. Alcohol or drug abuse is a path of destruction taken by a large number of veterans. Indeed, drug abuse after the war took out my own Vietnam vet cousin, and my cousin Bo, whom I mentioned before, has been very forthright about his struggles with alcoholism. Not unrelated is Shea's interpretation of Odysseus' interaction with both Circe and Calypso, which he sees as representing combat veterans' tendency to seek out solace in sex. A Navy veteran he calls wiry says, "When I got out, all I did was look for some relief, and the only release was fucking." As veterans counselor and author on trauma, Aphrodite Matsaki has said, "For some vets, sex is a tranquilizer or sedative for their anxieties." Circe and Calypso's episodes in the Odyssey may thus be interpreted as real attempts at calming the violent blowback of war with sex. Along with these coping mechanisms, I also want to address the grief and guilt that come with losing comrades in a war which you survive, which I see as represented in Odysseus' account of his catabasis, or his journey to the underworld. Here he encounters the shades not only of lost comrades, but also of his mother, Anticlea, who he did not know was dead. Shea sees this episode as a metaphor for the pervasive presence of the dead in the inner worlds of some combat veterans. Like many combat veterans, Odysseus is haunted by their deaths, some of which he bears some responsibility for. Shay is clear when he discusses this episode that he does not see Odysseus as suffering from survivor's guilt. I might argue, though, that while this is not expressed in his words or his behavior, symbolically the episode suggests it. After all, he attempts to reconcile with the shade of Ajax, but is rejected. He seeks confirmation from the shades of Achilles and Agamemnon that the glory and honor they obtained in war still holds meaning for them, but in each case, the response is troubling rather than comforting. And he learns from his mother's shade that she has died because of him, from grief over his prolonged absence. No resolution, no relief from these encounters, so that their deaths continue to hang over him. Even if Shay doesn't diagnose survivor's guilt in the original epic, several current adaptations of the Odyssey have made use of it. Looking again at the return, Pasolini's Odysseus suggests a clear sense of guilt and feelings of being haunted over the deaths of his companions. Another recent work based on the Odyssey also leans heavily into feelings of guilt, both for the companions that have been lost and for forced participation in wartime atrocities. Epic the Musical is a series of concept albums created by Jorge Rivera Herranz, a creation of which he documented on TikTok starting in January of 2021. Reportedly, he is now in talks with an animated movie and a stage version, along with 3 video games, with 2 already in development. In the meantime, however, his music has gone viral, inspiring a significant number of fan-made animations on YouTube and other platforms. Rivera Herranz opens his story with a conflicted Odysseus preparing to kill Hector's infant son Astyanax. In this, he follows a version that later summaries of the Trojan War epics attribute to the 7th century BC lost epic Iliad-Persis. Throughout the rest of the album, Odysseus is haunted by guilt over this act, and later also by the deaths of so many of his men who die on the journey home. Odysseus' tale of his adventures thus can be read as representing the many ways that veterans have difficulty reintegrating into their civilian life, so that they end up physically and mentally estranged from their loved ones. Shay sees this decade-long journey as analogous to 10 years at home, years of wildness, drinking, drugs, sex, living on the edge, crime, or being withdrawn. The returning warrior is home, but not present. 10 years at war, 10 years getting home. When Homer's Odysseus finally gets to Ithaca, my students are often surprised that he doesn't run to his wife and embrace his son and take his rightful place as king. Instead, his behavior is characterized by constant lying, coldness towards his wife, and cruelty towards his aged father, as well as with a lot of killing. But if read through Shay's lens, his behavior makes more sense. When he arrives at home, he fails to recognize his homeland, a disorienting bewilderment that many veterans experience when they come home. It does not seem like the same place they left, leaving them feeling estranged. Shay also addresses Odysseus' famous weariness and constant lying. He lies to the goddess Athena, he lies to his faithful servant Eumaeus, he lies to his son, to his wife, to his father. While many anthropologists would see this as a strategy common in the Mediterranean culture basin, Shay argues that his capacity for social trust has been destroyed. He doesn't trust anyone. Shay sees this as a central problem facing the most severely injured Vietnam veterans. Odysseus also adopts a disguise when he comes home. With the help of Athena, he disguises himself as a beggar in order to test the loyalty of his family and servants. In my view, this is clearly symbolic of the fact that when most veterans return, they are simply not the same person that they were when they left. Pasolini's film, too, taps into the idea that war changes you by suggesting that Odysseus feels himself damaged and diminished in certain ways. Epic the Musical also emphasizes this with Tiresias spelling it out for Odysseus in the underworld. I see a man who gets to make it home alive, but it's no longer you. And Odysseus himself acknowledges in this musical, acknowledges it when he is finally reunited with his wife. So, in speaking of wives, I will come back to the resolution this reunion represents, but now I want to pivot to the female perspective, which is too often ignored. Although steps have been made recently to remedy that in scholarship in recent years. In antiquity, war was overwhelmingly a male activity, but not exclusively. Most people are familiar with the famous Amazons, female warriors who fought against Greek heroes like Theseus and Achilles and Heracles. The Amazons are largely mythical, but there are historical accounts of real Greek women who took up arms in defense of their cities, which Virgil perhaps used as a model for a scene in the Aeneid. But these instances were well outside of the norm. As Hector tells his wife Andromache in Book 6 of the Iliad, war is the work of men, before he sends her back to her loom. In war, most of the time, women were at best on the sidelines, but all too often they were its victims, both during the war and in its aftermath. In the case of the Trojan War, this is the fate of the Trojan women in mass after the fall of their city. Of course, some women, like Aeneas' wife Creusa and the Trojan princess Polyxena, did not survive. These were often considered the lucky ones. In Euripides' Trojan Women, Andromache says that Polyxena, who was sacrificed on the tomb of Achilles at the war's conclusion, was fortunate in her fate, a sentiment that she repeats in Virgil's Aeneid, and which Polyxena herself expresses in Euripides' Hecuba. Those who lived were raped and enslaved, which was par for the course for the women of a defeated state at the conclusion of war in antiquity. As Teixeira Pather pointed out in a presentation at the Antiquity and Media Studies Conference last fall, the Trojan women are not assaulted by soldiers in the heat of battle. Rather, their mass rape is ordered by Nestor, a senior Greek commander. Pather also notes that soon afterwards, the treaty both Greeks and Trojans agreed to before Menelaus and Paris's duel stipulates that whichever side violates the terms of the agreement first shall have their wives raped by the opposing soldiers. At the war's conclusion, the Trojan princess Cassandra is raped on the altar, and afterwards she and the other Trojan women are distributed as slaves among the Greek warriors and expected to serve their beds. I'll note that a number of very good recent fictional animations center on the experiences of these women who are raped and enslaved at the end of the Trojan War. Unfortunately, as Pather, Emma Bridges, Kathy Gaka, and others have pointed out, the rape and brutalization of women in the course of waging war is all too present still in our world today, even if it is now considered a war crime and a human rights violation rather than accepted as socially normative. Indeed, Pat Barker about drawing on the experiences of subjugated women in our own time when she was writing Silence of the Girls, commenting that, quote, nothing happens in the book that is not happening in our contemporary world. Andromache shares this fate. As dramatized in Euripides' Trojan Women, after the war she is allocated to Neoptolemus, the son of the man who killed her husband, and her infant son is thrown from the walls. She is forced to serve Neoptolemus and share his bed, as is clear both in this play and in Euripides' earlier play Andromache, which is set several years later when she has had a child with her captor. When Neoptolemus later takes a Greek bride, Andromache is handed off in marriage to Helenus, her former brother-in-law. And as we see in Book 3 of Virgil's Aeneid, they build a city together, which is a miniature facsimile of Troy's former glory, complete with an empty tomb for her husband Hector. When Aeneas takes his leave of her, she fawns over his son, telling him, "You are the only image of my Stynax that's left. His hands, his eyes, his features, so like yours. He would be growing up now, just your age." Thus, Andromache's portrayal in the Aeneid can be read as an allegory for grieving widows and parents who are unable to move on after the death of their loved ones, remaining stuck in the past when their loved ones are still living. The Trojan Queen Hecuba loses many sons during the war, but her losses at the war's end are staggering, and her reversal of fortune is extreme. Her city is destroyed. She watches her husband and son slaughtered on the altar. Her status drops from queen to slave. Her daughter Polyxena is sacrificed at the tomb of Achilles. Her infant grandson is thrown from the walls, and she learns that her youngest son has been murdered by Polymestor, an ally who had been entrusted with keeping him safe. Her grief at these developments, of course, is profound. In Euripides' play that bears her name, she exacts vengeance on Polymestor by blinding him and killing his sons. In this, Hecuba might be compared to Achilles as Shea reads him in Achilles in Vietnam, in that, like him, a betrayal of trust and the death of a loved one sends her into a berserk state, where she commits atrocious acts of violence and barbarity. Her story, therefore, might make a fruitful platform for wives and mothers who suffer multiple losses of loved ones in battle, and whose grief spills over into violent or uncontrollable rage. After his blinding, Polymestor predicts what fate awaits Hecuba. I foretell that you shall drown at sea. You shall climb to the masthead and fall, changed to a dog, a bitch with blazing eyes. Symbolically speaking, the extreme nature of Hecuba's grief dehumanizes her and leads her to actions that disregard her safety and endanger her life. While this works as an indictment of war in that she is shaped into a monster by what she has experienced at the hands of men, as Nancy Rabinowitz puts it, in her transformation, we can see an inroad to using this play too as a means of processing extraordinary parental grief that alters you permanently. For the women of the defeated city, the situation is bleak indeed, but even for the wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters of the victors, the aftermath of war is hard. So let's turn back to Penelope for just a minute. As Homer's Odyssey opens, Penelope has been waiting for her husband for 20 years, 10 years of war, and 10 years after Troy's fall, long after the other warriors have arrived at home. She questions numerous travelers hoping to hear some word of her husband's fate. She cries herself to sleep. When a bard sings a song about Troy, she's distressed and descends from her rooms to ask him to play something else. Overwhelmingly, modern adaptations of the Odyssey focus on the male protagonist, as of course does the ancient epic. But nonetheless, they all do give an indication of the difficulties Penelope faces with the endless waiting, even if it's just as a corollary to the hero's journey. It's not until 2005 that Penelope gets a central place in the story in Margaret Atwood's celebrated novel, The Penelopiad, which I recommend. Penelope's experiences of waiting and wondering, hoping to hear some word, replicate the experiences of many women whose husbands are away at war. Even in our age of much better communication, when you have a loved one in a war zone, you constantly wait and worry. But for some military spouses, the waiting and worrying does not end when the war does. In a 2012 lecture, Daniel Levine related an anecdote about a time in the early 1980s when a woman came up to him after class at the University of Arkansas with tears in her eyes and said, "My husband has been missing in action in Vietnam for years. I know just how Penelope must have felt." In the Odyssey, Penelope is pressured to marry by a number of suitors who presume that her husband's dead and they want to take his place as king into her bed. She claims she will choose a husband when she finishes a shroud for her father-in-law, but the work she does by day she unweaves by night, delaying in the hopes that Odysseus will return. There are many ways to consider Penelope's shroud trick, but in relation to this discussion, I'll mention a practical one. As Emma Bridges notes in her book, Warrior Wives, Penelope's endless weaving can be seen as a self-distraction technique, as many waiting spouses absorb themselves in work, hobbies, or other tasks in order to take their mind off the difficulties of the situation. Corinne Pache also notes that this is a way of exerting control in a situation where Penelope has very little. Symbolically, Penelope's shroud trick represents her state of ambiguous loss, an idea developed by psychologist and sociologist Pauline Voss. Voss applies this term in situations where there's a lack of certainty as to whether or when a loved one will return. Penelope is in effect neither wife nor widow, a condition which Voss says, quote, freezes the grief process and prevents cognition, blocking coping and decision-making processes. Closure is impossible, end quote. Like many military spouses, Penelope is suspended in a state of inertia. Like her shroud, which is perpetually unfinished, she lives in a holding pattern. When Odysseus finally arrives at home, he comes to the palace disguised as a beggar in order to assess the loyalty of his wife and the other members of his household. He tests the suitors, observes the household servants, and has an interview with Penelope. From her perspective, in my opinion, this seems cruel, but we might connect his behavior to the deep-seated fears that even today's serving soldiers have that their place in the marital bed will be usurped in their absence, as Bridges puts it. Indeed, Clytemnestra, whose infidelity during her husband's absence culminates in his murder, is repeatedly held up in the Odyssey as a negative example, while her depiction of later tragedy cemented her place as an extreme personification of soldiers' anxieties about spousal infidelity while they are away at war. By the way, Clytemnestra, too, has received a modern treatment in 2023, which I haven't gotten to read, but if you have, please tell me. I've heard it's good. So, if Penelope recognizes her husband, and scholars literalizes the reality that soldiers are often transformed by their trauma, and when they return home, they are in some ways unrecognizable to their spouses, a theme Rivera Herons emphasizes in his musical. While doubts about her fidelity are an important theme throughout the epic, Penelope is ultimately cast as an ideal military wife, a model that persists only somewhat changed in form in the world today. Not only does Penelope turn out to have been faithful, but she's also passive, supportive of her husband, and largely confined to the domestic sphere. Despite Odysseus and Penelope's relatively happy reunion, after the end of the epic, we know from Tiresias' prophecy of the underworld that Odysseus has to set out again. As Shea puts it, after so much struggle, suffering, and loss to get home, he cannot be home. Sadly, this too is a reality for many of the heroes who work for the preservation or advancement of our own society. Changed, traumatized, and often damaged by the experience, they no longer feel that they fit into the society that they work to save. The stories of many of the ancient mythological figures we have examined here are compelling enough that they continue to speak to modern audiences, not just in translations of the original works that are primarily read in the classroom, and in modern literary and cinematic adaptations aimed at the general public, but also in the ancient themes and characterizations that shoot through as undercurrents in even seemingly unrelated pop culture productions, as the previous slide perhaps suggested. In addition to these uses of the ancient stories we have examined tonight, the Odyssey has been mined for spiritual edification, utilized as a tool to mend broken family relationships, and explored as a psychological instrument for coping with the exigencies of chance and fate. Brief drama, too, has been used to protest war, to help women process the trauma of incarceration or living with HIV, and to raise awareness about issues like human trafficking, gender justice, immigration policy, and more. By considering the ways these narratives can speak to real-world experiences, both then and now, we can better understand a world which, though far removed from us culturally, geographically, and chronologically, nonetheless have been so foundational in our own society. But at the same time, the refraction and ancient lens offered onto contemporary experiences can deepen our understanding of and empathy for people in our own lives who are dealing with the fallout of their own wars, both literal and metaphorical. Thank you.
Questions?
Of course, let me put up the promised resources in case anyone like that. I do have some minutes if anyone wants to take. Yes, if anyone has questions or conversations or additions, please. Yeah. Yes.
How does I've heard you talk so many times, and it's always so interesting. You know, whenever I hear you talk about your experiences. And I think it's so interesting how you present, for example, to your incarcerated population, like stories that really resonate with them. And I had a question, like how much does your incarcerated population, for example, like as an example, how do they play into your curricular decisions about what you're going to teach them and how you're going to teach them, right? Like how do they impact you deciding the material you cover?
Well, that's a good question. They do. I mean, I always ask them, what do you want me to teach next? Because I want them to take my classes. Unfortunately, I can't always get into the prison. I'm like trying to get into the prison. Because other teachers are also competing for a certain amount of slots, and I have to share. So I've been able to teach once a year since I started. Next year, I'm actually kind of like, maybe, unfortunately. But so I always ask them what they want to learn about. And, but to some extent, it also, I have to figure out what works best for their curriculum, because there's only a certain amount of classes that can be taught in there. And they might need a certain general education perspective or something like that. So sometimes it's partly, they need this. But overwhelmingly, the class that they have liked the most, many of my incarcerated students like classics a lot. And I have given, maybe you've heard presentations about how they just, some of them at least, are so excited about classics and find it so meaningful. But overwhelmingly, they like this class that discusses these issues the best, because it really resonated with them in a lot of ways. And when I taught them like classical mythology, they were picking some stuff up from there as well, partially because they had this class first, at least a number of them. And so they were looking for those connections, like how can I relate to the god, Dionysus or something like that. But this class worked the best for them because they just saw so much relationship between what they were experiencing in their lives, but also what they've heard from many people. Many of them have not left prison, but the reintegration is something that's very, very challenging. I've worked with a few formerly incarcerated students on our main campus, and some of them do very well, but even those say it's very hard, and then others just have a really hard time. So those kind of things really resonate with them in a lot of ways.
Thank you. Yeah.
Anything else? Yes?
So you said that at least one of your, the inmates whom you have taught, likened himself to a veteran, likened himself to, somebody returning from war, and then he went into this kind of berserker state when his girlfriend and children had been assaulted by someone else. Have any of your inmate students been themselves veterans?
So I asked about this before I came here, and none of the ones I've taught have shared that with me.
Okay.
And so I asked our director, and she said that she happens to know that at least one of our APUB students is a veteran,
Okay.
but she doesn't know, have information on the other ones.
So does that person process things, that you're reading differently from the others? And I'm imagining that many of these people have experiences that are not greatly unlike, wartime. That certain traumas they're experiencing are like not greatly dissimilar from being in battle. But I'm just wondering, is there a difference between that sort of like battle-like situation versus being in an actual sanctioned battle?
Well, unfortunately, the one that I know was a veteran was not one of my students.
Okay.
So I can't make that comparison. But the ones that were in that class, the first class, many of them described their backgrounds. One of them, really, almost all of them came from like, inner city kind of gang type backgrounds. One of them did not. One of them came much more like from a background that I am from. But the vast majority of them describe their upbringing as kind of like being in a war zone. Even if their reasons for being there would be very different from those of someone in the military, right? And being literally in the middle of crossfire, one of them getting shot when he was 14 years old and things like that. So they had some of the trauma that was experienced through the violence and atrocities and danger and things like that, even if they didn't have, even if it's not an exact parallel. A lot of it worked very well for them for that reason. But unfortunately, I didn't have a veteran in my particular class. Yeah?
So a lot of my students, writers here on campus, creative writers, like to try to adapt or update myth, classical story. And I'm wondering if your students, I see them writing about their identification with particular characters. Have they done their own adaptations or scenes, stories in which they update, reset like many of the novels that you're talking about?
So in the first class that I taught, our final project, I gave them a whole bunch of leeway to do what they wanted. And the student that I mentioned before, Ben, who was processing his cousin's death, suicide through Ajax, actually rewrote that scene and reenacted that scene for the class as part of that process. In that same kind of set of presentations, another student, Chris, rewrote a scene from the Ajax, and I'm not going to be able to kind of reconstruct it for you very well, but he rewrote it. It was a chorus who was blaming the god of war, for their troubles and stuff like that. And I thought he was going to rewrite it, and I read about this in the article that Jimmy mentioned that just came out. I thought he was going to write about, the prison, it's their fault, in the system, blah, 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 but he wrote about his role in his situation and how it was him so he was processing his mistakes that he made through this passage of the Ajax. It was it was beautiful. Everybody in the whole class was in tears, including me. So we had them do some things like that. And then we also did some exercises in mythology where they gave presentations embodying someone. And many times they would choose someone that they felt an affinity with for some reason. Sometimes some kind of, troubling stuff comes out. Sometimes it was done just for fun, but they also were kind of processing it in a more lighthearted way, which we talked about a lot as well. We watched Oh Brother, Where Art Thou in that class, just as a means of because it was like trauma. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And how we process trauma with humor, and more trauma. So, we had to have a little bit of a break. But yeah, we did a whole bunch of different things like that. In my last class I taught, which was the Sites and Monuments of Athens, so it was a material culture class, where we looked at art and architecture of Athens. And I had them write travel journals. When we started the class, I thought that they could not ever travel to Greece because felons were forbidden of traveling to Greece, but apparently there's a Jewish law that allows them, many of them to do it. So they might have hope of doing it. Anyway, it was kind of a fantasy journal. And so one of them in particular, I actually sent his journal in for a contest because it was so well done. So it was almost like a happy version of Dante's Inferno, where he was guided by the spirit of Odysseus to go on this journey and things like that. So they're using a lot of imagination to kind of figure things out. And his whole thesis was, I am traveling to Greece, through this class and through my studies and things like that. And it was just beautifully done. And he's an excellent artist as well. So he can do this professionally. Jorge.
I'm trying to word this as a question. Do you think that society should encourage, from the perspective of veterans, kind of project their image onto what you describe as fantasies or fantasies, whatever you call it? Do you feel like that's fair, especially you could say it's led to kind of glorification of war, especially when you think about war movies and American Sniper and stuff like that? Is it fair for the Western nations, who's the worst of crime, and or inspired the worst of other countries to go on and project their image onto, say a fake?
Okay, so like the ancient warriors that were done. Okay, that's an interesting question. So what I would say, and if anyone in the classes is here can tell me what you think. In my perspective, there's a lot of ways you can process classical antiquity. And when we talk about movies today, big blockbuster films, are often these glory and honor and stuff like that. And you've got Maximus and Gladiator, things like that. And even if there's some complexity in those films, those are often processed by the general public as just kind of glorifying, classical antiquity and the violence of classical antiquity. And I think most of us classicists kind of recoil against that, because classical antiquity was awesome. We study it as super entertaining and stuff like that, but it's not unproblematic at all. And these warriors are not people to really emulate. None of them are unproblematic at all. So when we're kind of digging into this stuff, and if they're kind of identifying with these warriors, it's not just making war and their violence unproblematic at all. If you're doing it in a nuanced way, which I think Brian Dories does, and I've worked with his stuff a lot more than with Peter Meinig's stuff. But it's looking at kind of the troubling aspects of it, if that makes some sense, and not ignoring that. And I also would say that in classics as a discipline, we have, in recent decades, tell me if you think I'm wrong, we've done a lot to kind of push back against kind of this simplistic interpretation of classics in that way. We're looking a lot more at the troubling aspects and how different identities were represented in different ways, and just making it a lot more rich and more nuanced and less kind of like I was talking about earlier, just the entertainment value or the glory of ancient Greece, that's unproblematic. There's not a single classicist I know today that kind of subscribes to that, we're the foundation of Western civilization. we're not. We are big contributors, but also Western civilization is usually a problematic concept because it's not all about the West. It's mostly coded as white European ancestry. But anyway, there's just all kinds of problems. So I don't know if that's actually kind of getting at your question, but I do think that there's a danger that people equate ancient Greek warriors and Roman warriors as like just glory, honor, and unproblematically heroic. But I don't think that that most people who dig into it have that view at all, because they're enormously problematic. They lie, they cheat, they steal, they have sex all over the place, they commit enormous atrocities, they commit suicide, and they're damaged psychologically, most of them. Yeah.
Can I add one question onto it?
Yeah.
So, just including your last work, including this, how do you feel like, I guess your work has contributed to, I guess, dismantling this idea that classics is I guess, a representation of, like, how it's been used in recent years that made white supremacy and stuff like that, and quoting this idea that Greeks and Romans were just purely white, so people of color.
Right.
So I heard, I think, early, wrote a book earlier about where you're teaching a class that includes race and ethnicity.
Right,
How
yeah.
do you feel like there were aids in dismantling?
Well, I try to, because, I mean, I also, so I haven't taught that class in a few years, but even in other classes, like one class that I do that a lot is classics in film, which you wouldn't necessarily be like, classics in film, what does that have to do with race? But if you look at our history of classical movies and stuff, the casting is awfully white, right? And so we have, that's, in fact, that might be the primary place that we got the idea that Greek and Roman antiquity was white, and not white, that's just kind of a false equation. So we talk, for instance, about casting decisions and things like that, and we look at kind of the virulent, racism and hatred that comes up when you cast a black man as Achilles, or any prominent, like this is Troy Fall of the City, when a black man played Achilles, and there were so many racist people coming out and just saying Achilles can't be black. He's got blonde hair. Like, okay. I'm like, he also, the actor was bald, but nobody talked about that, right? Nobody talked about Menelaus not being red-haired. Nobody cared about that. It was racism, right? So we look not just in the class focused on race and ethnicity and antiquity. In almost all of our classes, and I know that my colleagues at Augustana do this as well, we talk about these issues as they come up and try to kind of push back against them, because it is this kind of whitewashed view that a lot of people had for a long time that is kind of really entrenched, right? And so the best way to do it is kind of teach that. And I don't know if I'm actively working to dismantle it. I mean, I guess I am, but that makes it sound very grand. I'm trying to do it in my small way every day, but it's it is hard. You see it in society, right? But it's important to me that we push back against that, because that's my discipline, and I don't want my discipline being used to promote white supremacy and other things like that. Is that?
I think so.
I saw somebody else, but I don't know. Yeah?
Thank you for your wonderful talk. My students are going to be so thrilled that you brought up Epic the Musical, because they talk about it constantly. I know that you teach men in the prison, but I'm wondering if in your research, and I really appreciated that you talked about the women at home, but because unlike in the ancient world, a lot of veterans and incarcerated people are women, I'm wondering if you've read anything about how female veterans or women, incarcerated women, react to reading classics.
Right. Before I answer your question, I should mention that I didn't handle that very well earlier. I mean, in antiquity, mostly, of course, we have women outside war, men inside war. We don't have that today at all. And so it's not just wives at home, and I kind of made that a binary because I was tracking it with the antiquity, so sorry about that. We have many female veterans today, and the men who are waiting at home, so spouses. Yes, I have not had the opportunity to work with any incarcerated women, just because, well, there are far fewer incarcerated women than men, and the two prisons that I work with that are in nearby proximity to our town are men's prisons. But the image that I had up there a little bit earlier was of the Medea project, which utilizes the play Medea with incarcerated women. So that's, and I haven't utilized it, but I have thought about using, and I haven't really dug into it, using Medea. There's a lot you could do with Medea and processing all kinds of women's trauma or like immigrant trauma, things like that. So that's another way to dig in, not with incarcerated populations who don't have access to that. But what was the other thing I was going to say about? I forgot. It just blanked out. It's another thing. I'll come back to me. Sorry.
I think on that note, it's 8:35.
Okay.
Good talk. Thank you so much. Those who have skedaddling to do, things to work on, go ahead and skedaddle to those things and get to work on them. If you have any particular questions for Dr. Day or just wish to stick around longer to hear what else people have to ask, feel free to do so. But thank you for coming out. Thank you for all my students who are here. I appreciate that you made it. Thanks to all the other guests. And good night. Thanks for everything.